about this. So I'm going to talk for about a half hour on this work that my colleague Alice Feng and I have done on creating and applying equity awareness to our data and data visualizations. And what you see in front of you is the cover of the new report that will come out in just a couple of weeks about this guide. So the work that I'm going to talk about today is really extending the work that we've done just a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, and we're going to extend that pretty dramatically in just a few weeks. So let me just back up here. So, so my colleague Alice and I wrote this paper in August, and we've been doing a lot more work on this topic over the last few months. And so for people who are working with data, who are communicating data, who are visualizing data, in our efforts to open minds and to shape decisions and offer solutions and affect policy, it's important that we think intentionally about how we can learn from and speak to the audiences that reflect the richness of America's communities. And the work that we've been doing is trying to help those of us who are working in this space to do a better job of thinking about race, ethnicity, gender, and intersections of all those different identifying characteristics and how we talk and write about them. So this issue obviously has really come to the fore over the past 12 to 15 months, since especially since the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And one of the inspirations of this work is to think about how we as people working with data can contribute to this national and I would say even international discussion about race and these other groups. Now, before we get into content, I think it's important to root this presentation in my lived experience because, and I hate to say middle-aged, but like over the last year, I feel more middle-aged than ever. So I'm going to say middle-aged white guy. I'm perhaps maybe not like the best person to be talking about how to approach race and ethnicity in data and how we write about and present data. But I'm also, I am a Jewish American, so I have experienced my share of anti-Semitism, but it's very different than you know, not being able to walk down my neighborhood or being fearful of walking down my neighborhood with, you know, a hooded sweatshirt, or not feeling comfortable talking to the police. It's just a much different experience. And I think many, especially Black and African-American people in this country feel. But as someone who spends a lot of time working on public policy issues, someone who is very concerned about how we communicate data and analyze data, and also to the father of two young kids, I think it's important that we have these discussions and we start to change the way we are talking about analyzing and visualizing data around race. So what we're going to talk about what I'm going to talk about today, and what we talk about in the paper and in the new volume that will come out in just a few weeks, is how we who are creating visualizations every day, how we are communicating analysis and evaluations, how we can improve the way we present different groups. What we're not going to focus on are visualizations that are explicitly racist. So the image you see in front of you is from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This map was produced in 1937. The HOLC was a federal agency that was, its responsibility was to assess mortgage risk in metropolitan areas across the country. And so they produced a whole number of maps like this. So if you've ever heard the term redlining, this is the maps that, that's where the phrase comes from. And so the map that you see in front of you is from Richmond, Virginia. And each of the different colors of the map represents different risk of the mortgage risk. And I'm going to show you a quote from Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, which I think is a fantastic book about housing and law in the United States as it applies to risk. And for this particular map, Rothstein writes, the whole created color-coded maps of every metropolitan area in the nation, with the safest neighborhoods colored green and the riskiest colored red. And I keep losing my thing. A neighborhood earned a red color if African Americans lived in it, even if it was a solid middle-class neighborhood of single-family homes. So these redlining maps are explicitly racist, and these maps have an enduring effect on the wealth and income accumulation of Black and African American families, not just within the generation in the 1930s, but across generations all the way through today. And we see the enduring legacy of these redlining maps in metropolitan areas all across the country. So while these maps and visualizations that are explicitly racist are obviously of a concern, I'm hopeful that the majority of work that, especially people on this call that are producing, is not explicitly racist, but we want to learn how to do a better job and how we talk about, visualize results or effects or demographics about race and ethnicity. So as I mentioned, our Do No Harm Guide is coming out in just a few weeks. It's going to be launched on June 9th. It's the original paper, just as like a kind of little side note. So you're going to get the inside tip because I haven't talked about this publicly yet. So the original paper for this was about 4.5 pages. We were fortunate enough to be connected with the Tableau Foundation, and they wanted to fund additional work on this. And we thought, well, we'll just write some more on this. There's some more things we have sort of in the hopper that we didn't get to write in this smaller piece, but we want to write about. We'll figure like a 15-page document is what we'll come up with. The current paper is 55 pages. We ended up interviewing over 20 different people across 12 different sites across the United States. We try to address more than just data visualization. It's more about the entire data and research ecosystem. So how do we think about having diverse teams in our organizations? How do we think about communicating qualitatively with the communities and the people that we're communicating with? So it's a much more in-depth guide, and hopefully I'm hopeful that you will check it out. Okay, so the through line through this entire research project is all about empathy. And what we need to do as people who are conducting research is to think about how we would want to be portrayed if we were part of a visualization. And in one of our interviews with Kim Bui, who's a data journalist, she, I think, succinctly put this the best. If I were one of the data points on this visualization, would I feel offended, right? And that's really turning how we think about research. I think for many quantitative researchers, especially, I mean, I'm an economist by background, so certainly for most economists, thinking about like people is very different than thinking about like, it's just a data point on my computer. But if we turn that perspective around and think about how would I feel if I was portrayed in this visualization, would I be offended? That's an approach that we can take. I think approach that we can take to take a better racially equitable view and awareness to our data visualizations. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few different topics, and then we'll have some time for questions. So I'm going to start with language. So the issue about language, generally, not just obviously for data visualization, is that it's always changing, it's always evolving, and it's nuanced. I'm actually in the middle of a Code Switch podcast episode this morning about the phrase "people of color" and whether that phrase should or should not be used. So that's, I'm sure many of us know that we have this new term BIPOC or BIPOC, which also, like, how do we pronounce it? It's like a whole other side conversation. But these terms and phrases are always evolving. So let me show you an example of what I mean by that. So in August of 2020, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey, and they asked a sample of people who identified as Hispanic and Latino what they think about the term Latinx. So this term Latinx has gained in popularity over the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years to be more gender inclusive. But in the Pew study, they found amongst people who identified as Hispanic and Latino that about 2/3 of them said that Latinx should not be used to describe the Hispanic or Latino population, which is really, I think, surprising for many of us who may be starting to use that term. And there's a lot of discussion about why the Latinx term may or may not be preferred. And it seems like we're continuing to evolve on this particular term among the others. Hispanic and Latino. There's a great book by Christina Mora, who is a sociologist at UC Berkeley, about the origin of the terms Hispanic and Latino and how is the accumulation of politics, Spanish language television, and the Census Bureau over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And now we've moved into this phrase Latinx, and now even more recently, we've moved into this word Latine, which may be easier to pronounce, is more more in line with the Spanish language itself. So as you can see, these languages continue to evolve. But let's talk about how this applies to data visualization specifically. So what you see here is the top third of a Tableau data visualization. This is called a Bivariate Choropleth Map. I'm going to talk about what that means in just a moment. So there's, in this visualization, I'm not showing the whole thing, in the top third is this map for Black Americans. There's another map for white Americans, and then there's a third map for Hispanic or Latino Americans. Okay, So that's the entire visualization. I'm just going to focus on this top map. So before I get into the language, let me explain what you're looking at. So this is what's called a bivariate choropleth map. Now a choropleth map, just a standard choropleth map, you've seen a million times, I'm sure. It looks something like this. We use shades of color to encode data on the map. So in this map from the Urban Institute on the unemployment rate, we have the lowest unemployment rates in the lightest blue, and then the highest unemployment rates in the darkest blue. So that's how a choropleth map works. A bivariate choropleth map is going to put two variables on the same map. So in this particular map, the author is going to put percentage of people who identify as Black on one axis, and then the poverty rate on another axis. And so I'm going to zoom in onto that legend so you can see it in a little more detail. And so what you see here is we have these two variables. So as we move along the horizontal axis, right, we go from areas that have a lower density of Black Americans to a higher density of Black Americans. And then along the vertical axis, we have the poverty rate going from low poverty rates to higher poverty rates. So counties that have a smaller density of the Black population and a lower poverty rate are those, orangish, goldish colors. So that's kind of like in the, Rocky Mountain West. And then states that have a higher density of Black Americans and a higher poverty rate are in that really dark purple color in the southeast part of the United States. Okay, so that's how the map works. But now more importantly for our discussion, let's focus on the words. So the words, the labels that are used here is more Black and more poverty, okay? But let's look at poverty first. Poverty is an experience. It's not a static description of a person, right? I can be in poverty this year, but not in poverty next year. And more importantly, to the main thrust of this work, that the word Black references skin color, doesn't reference people. And of course, race is just a construct. Race is essentially something that we've made up. But in this example, again, going back to Kim's statement, how would I feel? Again, I'm not a Black American, but how would I feel is being described as more Black? And I don't think that's the term that we want to use. We want to reference people and not their skin color. So what are some alternatives? Well, we could say larger proportion of the Black population and larger proportion of people in poverty. Are these longer? Yeah. Are they more verbose? Yeah. Do they fit as nicely and neatly on, right above the arrow? No, they don't. But they're a more equitable way to think about representing people. And at the core of what we want to do here is we want to use people first language, right? We want to say things like people with disabilities rather than disabled people. We want to reference people, not strictly their skin color. And the author, who is kind enough to let us use this example in the report and was very willing to have these discussions with us, ultimately changed the titles in the legend from more Black to larger Black population, and then left the label for poverty, even though one could argue that could be improved as well. Now, again, language can always change. This is a picture from the admission sign at Botanical Gardens near my house in Northern Virginia. I just love the phrase super adults. Like, I think that's like a great, positive, affirming way to categorize that group of people, right? So much better, I think, than senior citizens, so much better than elderly, right? Language is evolving, language is nuanced, and so we have to be more comfortable, I think, to be able to have these conversations and to think about how we want to use the language. Okay, so let's talk about ordering labels. So I think for many people on this call, we're used to grabbing data, doing an analysis and evaluation, and then presenting the results in a table or a bar chart or some other chart. And we kind of just put the data out there and whatever labels are sort of just come out of the data. And in the economics field, I could go to any journal. This is just like, I just randomly selected 4 papers in the economics literature and took a picture of the main results of regression results in the main table. And you can see in all of these, the order is always white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, other. It's always some combination of that ordering, okay? So where does that come from? And as we think about taking a more racially equitable view to our research, we need to be thinking about how we're going to present these results. So what I want to show you is the question about race from about 5 different major US federal government surveys, okay? So this is the question about race from the decennial census, and I trust, especially on this call, everybody filled out their census form. I know in a room of evaluators, I feel very comfortable that everybody was responsible with their decennial census form. So here's the form that you filled out. So this is a question on race. Check a box. You can see that we start with the category for white, and then there's an area where you can write in, additional information: Black or African American, American Indian or Alaskan Native. There's a sort of combination of groups below, and then obviously more area to write in, and then some other race at the bottom. So that's the decennial census. In the current population survey, also conducted by the Census Bureau, the interviewer says to the interviewee, I'm going to read to you a list of 5 race categories. You may choose one or more races. And you can see here that there are 6 options that the respondent can reply with. In the survey of income and program participation, the interviewer enters their best guess as to the race of the reference person. You can see here that there are 6 options coded 1 to 6, and then the letter D for don't know. The survey of consumer finances, which is run by the Federal Reserve. Please look at this card. Which of these categories do you feel best describes you? Again, here we have 8 different categories: 1 to 6, a -7 for other, and then a 0 for no further responses. Panel study of income dynamics from the University of Michigan. Interviewer asks, what is your race? You can see we have 6 different categories. I always have to rethink about this because for some reason they have some other race as a number 7, not as 6. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it's okay. So 6 different options here. And then finally, the consumer expenditure survey, we have 9 different options. Okay, for race in that particular question. Let me go back through, if you haven't already seen it, let me go back through these survey questions and highlight the first group, the first option, the group that is coded 1 in all of these surveys. In the decennial census, it's the white group. In the current population survey, it's white. In the survey of income and program participation, it's white. In the survey of consumer finances, it's white. In the panel study of income dynamics, it's white. And this consumer expenditure survey, it's white. In all of these groups, the default, the first, the number 1 group is white. And so it's perhaps no surprise that when you go through the economics literature, or perhaps any social science literature for that matter, you see this basic ordering of white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, other, because it's just following how the data are spit out of the survey. And so one of the things that we all can do, and we can all do this right now, is we go back to the work that we're doing in our tables and our charts and our graphs and our diagrams, is to think about, is there a better way to order these labels, to present these results in our work? So what are the questions that we can ask? And I should say there are no answers to these questions, right? Like these are all up for grabs in terms of what's the right strategy. But what I'm encouraging you to do here is to just take a pause and think about, is there a better strategy? So one option, does your study focus on a particular community? If it does, perhaps that group should be presented first. That's the first thing that people are going to see. Is there a particular argument or story that you're trying to tell? And if so, the order or the presentation of the results should reflect that argument instead of just taking the data out of the survey as they come. And finally, is there a quantitative relationship that can guide how you're going to order or sort your groups? Can they be sorted alphabetically? Can they be sorted by population size? Which population size is a perfectly reasonable strategy. In that case, for the United States as a whole, white would come first. That's not the case for, say, Washington, D.C., right? Could they be sorted by sample size, either weighted or unweighted in the survey? Or can they be sorted by the magnitude of the effect of the results? These are all questions that we, as especially those of us who are receiving data and working with the data, need to consider. For those of us who are collecting data, who are actually conducting the surveys, we need to take an extra step and think even more carefully about how we are actually presenting the options in the questions of our survey. Okay, so we've talked about language and ordering the labels. Let's talk about missing groups. And I think one of the easiest ways to think about visualizing or writing or talking about missing groups is to think about gender, right? We know gender is not binary, and yet every major federal survey, you'll get the options of male and female. So that's sort of I think the easiest way to think about this. And there was a great little Twitter discussion where a data scientist from Google asked for the examples of the worst gender drop-down menus that people could find. So this is just a selection of 4 of them. My favorite, I guess in quotes, is the top left one, which is female, male, NA, unknown, or tax entity. So I don't know like what they're thinking, but you can see here that like these are some of the ones that you can find around the internet. But let's take it a step further. Well, before I get to that, I guess the aggregation effect here is also an issue, right? From the presidential election in November. This is from a poll in Florida. If you looked at the group of Hispanic and Latinos as one aggregate uniform group, you would see close to a 50-50 split in their preference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Whereas if you start disaggregating groups, for example, between Cubans and people identify as Cuban, people identify as Puerto Rican, you get almost the exact polar opposite preference for the 2 candidates. But let's think about things that we can do specifically in our work. So let's talk about the word other. So we often get in our surveys, well, I'll just take it simple: white, black, Asian, and other. There's other aggregate group, which the word other is literally othering this group, right? It's, we want to use people first language. We want to think about how we would feel if we were represented in this visualization or this table. So how would we feel if we were referred to as the word other? So this is obviously just the definition of the word other from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. But what struck me here is the last entry in the definition: disturbingly or threateningly different. And I think that's really the issue with the connotation of the word other. It's why there's this whole discussion about othering people, is that there's this connotation that the word other is somehow disturbing or somehow threatening. So what are some alternatives that we could use for the word other? So one of the most common ones that we've heard and have read about is using the word and other. Now, grammatically, it's not perfect, right? So the word and other refers, as a synonym for other when it's used for resulting in an increase or an amount or number. So it's not perfect. I think I could get over that, but we also think there are some additional or alternative phrases or words that we could use. So here's a list that we think are viable. So another race or races, additional groups, all other self-descriptions, people identifying as other or multiple races, identity not listed, or identity not listed in the survey. Now, I want to just pause real quickly, just make one more note about this. That if you're like, so when I think about these alternative phrases or words, as a researcher, I do get a little nervous because I want to be as true to the data as possible. So when I think about someone taking their survey where the options are white, black, Asian, other, that person checked the box for the word other. It was the only option available to them, so they checked the box. So technically, strictly speaking, that's what they chose. But I think if we can agree that the word other is not a term that we want to use, and we want to use these alternative, I think what are better words and phrases, I think all we really need to do is to say in the note to the table or in a note in the paper or in the graph to say, the survey used the word other, we are going to use all other self-descriptions, which is also technically accurate, right? It's also technically true. And we think that that's just a better phrase that we're going to use. But if you are uncomfortable changing the word that's used in the survey, I think the solution to that is just adding a note, adding a footnote, adding an endnote to the paper, to the table, to the graph. Now, we could discuss long and hard, and happy to have the discussion about alternatives to the word other. I think we could all agree that using the phrase something else is not the right phrase that we should be using, right? Like, I don't know what CNN was thinking here, but like something else doesn't describe people. So we just want to I think we can all agree we're going to avoid. All right, I think finally let's talk about colors, because this is such a big aspect of especially data visualization. And we want to think very carefully about the colors that we use in our visuals. We want to obviously avoid the stereotypical colors, pink for women, blue for men, those stereotypical gender colors. We want to avoid colors that are maybe reflecting skin color. But there's some more subtle ways in which color can come into play in data visualization. Okay, so what you see in front of you is a screenshot from June of 2020 of MIT's, what they call their student diversity dashboard. So what it is, just a Tableau dashboard that's showing data and trends on the racial makeup of their student body. So the line chart on the left is showing changes over time. And then the bar chart on the right is showing the distribution, I guess, in each of the different schools within the university. I'm going to zoom in again on the legend here. So this is what the legend looks like in that dashboard. And so you can see here in the kind of left column, we have Black or African American students in the dark red, going down that column to Asian students in the lighter red. And then the right column, we have almost the pinkish color for the students that identify as 2 or more races, white students in the blue color, international students and students who didn't identify their race in the gray colors. Now, there's a couple of problems with this particular legend. First problem is that by using shades of red to represent all of these students who identify as students of color, and then putting the white students in the blue, this color palette explicitly says that white students are the norm, that white students are to what all of these other students should be compared. Okay, so that the white group is sort of the default, the white group is the norm. I think even more importantly, and again, when I think about critiquing data visualizations like this, I don't think it comes from a place of malice. I think it comes from just a place of not knowing and not recognizing how color can be used in this particular way. But when I look at a color palette like this, what I see is a color ramp. And if we go back to our Choropleth map from earlier, right, we had in our Choropleth map of the unemployment rate, we had states with the lower unemployment rates in the light blue and states in the darker, and the states with the higher unemployment rates in the dark blue. Well, that same color ramp is similar sort of style of the color ramp, the sequential color ramp is being used in this MIT dashboard. And so it implicitly implies that Black or African-American students are somehow more or greater than students who identify as Asian or students who identify as 2 or more races. Okay, so there's 2 problems here. I think the second one is even more problematic, but one that probably the creator didn't even recognize was an issue. After a little bit of feedback on Twitter, they changed the dashboard a few weeks later in July. And so again, same setup, different color palette. Let's zoom in. Maybe slightly better here. Black or African-American students identified in the green color. But again, we have Hispanic or Latino students, American Indian, Alaska Native students, Native Hawaiian students, and Asian students, all shades of blue, 2 or more races in the purple color, white students in peach, international students in red, and unknown in the gray. So again, there's still a color ramp going on here, still implicitly implying that somehow Hispanic or Latino students are more than or greater than Asian students. So we need to be careful about our colors. Now, is it easy to pick out 9 separate colors? No, it's not necessarily easy to do that. It can be done, right? This is from the Color Brewer tool, which is one of the really, I think, favorite color picker tools in the data viz field. I picked this color palette in like 2 seconds, right? So now I'm not saying that the visual would be so much better if I use this particular color palette. It's still got shades of green in there and shades of blue, but we need to think very carefully about the colors that we're using. We might also just need to think more broadly about the visualization type that we're using. And I won't talk about it today, but in the original paper and in the newer paper, we talk in depth about a data tool that we created at the Urban Institute, where we were looking at trends from the census pulse survey, so trends in food insecurity amongst kids, school attendance amongst kids during the pandemic. And the first draft of that dashboard put all these racial groups onto a single graph. And one of the issues there is, how do you choose the colors? And the other issue is you start comparing one racial group to another racial group when maybe one racial group shouldn't be perceived as the norm. And so sometimes it's a better approach or a better strategy to break that single graph up into separate visualizations, so that the reader or the user is not instinctively or implicitly comparing one racial group to another racial group. So in the broader paper, we also spent a lot of time talking about engaging or reflecting the lived experiences of the people and the communities that we are focusing on in our research. And in my experience as an economist, I was trained in quantitative methods and received zero, not a little bit, but zero qualitative methods training. Virtually all the qualitative researchers that I know have had at least some quantitative methods training, right? They at least know how to clean data and summarize data and run regressions. So what I think we need to do as a field is we need to move, especially the quantitative folks, over a little bit closer to the qualitative folks so that we can do a better job of communicating with those peoples and communities that we are focusing on and reflecting their lived experiences. Because there is a rich diversity in America and across the world and in our own communities. So what can we do as individuals and as research teams as we are working through our data, working through our graphs, working through our analysis? First, are we using language that is consistent with how people refer to themselves and others? Should we be using the term Latinx, for example? Should we be using the term Latin? Just reflecting on this podcast I'm listening to this morning, is the phrase people of color one that we should be using? And the way that we can best do that, when possible, of course, we should talk to the audience that we hope will read our work and use our work. What is the language that they are using? How do they refer to themselves? I keep admitting people into the room, and so I keep losing my PowerPoint here. Okay, what have we missed in our visuals that are inconsistent with a racial equity framework? What colors are we using? I haven't talked about icons in this particular talk, but it's something that we go into more detail. What icons, what visuals of people are we using that may not be consistent with that racially equitable framework? And how can we address those and think more strategically about doing a better job? Because some particular chart types may lend themselves to more of a human connection than others. So take a bar chart, for example. A bar chart is essentially aggregating observations in our data into abstract rectangular shapes. Where if I use an icon chart or a unit chart with small shapes, people might be able to connect with the subject matter better, might be a better way to remind readers that there are people being represented in the visualization through the use of those multiple individual shapes. And finally, how can we take a more empathetic approach to creating data visualizations and creating research and conducting research more generally? How can we do that so that we more accurately and respectfully account for other people's lived experiences? Remember, our lived experience of, especially if we're conducting research, we have the opportunity and I would say the blessing of actually spending our lives exploring questions that are important to our society and our communities. How can we think about the communities and the people that we're focusing on so that they can use the results, that those results can be used in policy to improve policy and ultimately improve society? So I'm going to close here so that we can have time, so I can answer some questions and have some discussion. But I just want to close with saying that, for many of us, especially those of us who are more quantitative people who tend to go and download data sets from the Census Bureau or from the Federal Reserve Board or for wherever it is, we tend to just grab those data and we start clicking behind our keyboard and we start writing our paper and we put up a table and a graph. There are people behind those data sets. And so data are a reflection of the lives of those real people. And if we as researchers, as data visualization specialists, as communicators, can take a more empathetic view of how we're representing people and communicating our work to people and to communities, I think our work will have a greater impact and will be more useful for those groups for whom we think it will help and advantage. So I'm going to stop there. I want to say thank you for attending. It was great to see all those admit buttons coming up. It was a little frustrating to click back and forth, but it was great. So I'm going to stop there. I have more to share if we have time, but I want to make sure we have time for questions.
Thank you so much, John. I think everyone has been singing your praises in the chat and so grateful. I've been getting a lot of questions about the recording. So if you didn't see that message, it will be it is being recorded and will be posted on the site. There were a couple questions about accessibility and 508 compliance as it relates to this stuff. I'm also going to drop a link to an upcoming event that we have in August with Anne Emery, who's going to be talking about accessibility. But I wonder if you could touch on that and maybe save some for Anne as well, because we probably have some other questions coming.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to be clear that this particular work does not focus on accessibility. We are planning to do a whole other body of work on accessibility. And accessibility for data visualization is actually really even more difficult. Because if you go to like, you go to the New York Times or the Washington Post website and there's an interactive data visualization, you start clicking around. Those visualizations, it's not entirely very easy to make those accessible. Think about someone who needs a screen reader who might have vision impairments, or take it a step further, people who have maybe physical impairments and can't use a mouse the way that many of us, do every day. So there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to accessibility. I'll give you just one example that I think is something that everyone on this call can do immediately. When it comes to posting graphs or images on a web page, one thing that everyone here can do is to add alternative text to those images. And so I want to just so in case you don't know what alternative text or alt text is, it's what a screen reader will read as it goes through the web page. So there are lots of these screen reader tools out there, but essentially what a screen reader does is what it sounds like. It literally reads the screen to someone who might have a vision impairment. So as the screen reader is going through the text on the screen, it comes to, let's say, your bar chart, okay? Now, if you haven't added any alt text to that bar chart, the screen reader is either just going to skip right over it, so the person won't even know that there's a figure there, or it will sometimes, depending on the tool, read the file name. So imagine how annoying it's going to be as it's reading your explanation of this content, and then it comes to, and then it says figure1.png. Like, that's not super useful, right? So what we want to do, and you can do this in all the major web development toolkits, is add alt text to your graph. And the alt text, the easiest way to think about it is, and you should be doing this in your titles for your graphs as well. So this is where it's very handy. What do you want someone to get out of that graph? This line is going up, this line is going down, this point is over here, this point is over here. And that's really what you should be saying in the title of the graph anyways. But if you think about what is that like short tweet or message or headline that you want someone to get out of the graph, that becomes your alt text. And I'll just say one more thing on this. At the Urban Institute, we have multiple blogs, but our main blog, Urban Wire, our researchers will write the blog post, they'll create the graph, and then they'll send that package over to the editing team. And the editing team will obviously do their editing, they'll go through the graph and make sure it's all set. And in the past, we would have like someone from the blog team or the web team would like write the alt text as the post goes up. It's like, oh, we forgot, we should write some alt text, right? We weren't really thinking carefully and strategically about it. Now what we do is we're requiring our authors to write the alt text. And we do that for two reasons. The first reason is the alt text is really content, right? So it should really, I'm not saying that our blog editors couldn't write it, they certainly can, but it's content. And so the researcher really should be responsible for that alt text. But I think more importantly is requiring the researcher, the author, to write the alt text makes it clear to the researcher that they need to be thinking about these other communities and these other, these individuals who might be having trouble using using these, using this particular website. There are, I think the statistic I have is there's 27 million people who have difficulties accessing the web. And that's from vision, physical, intellectual impairments. That doesn't even count people who have difficulties accessing the internet because of broadband limitations. That's a whole other discussion that we could have, right? There's millions of people in this country who do not have broadband internet. So if you or your organization is in the habit of creating really data-heavy, data-dense dashboards, keep in mind that many people, especially those in rural areas of the United States, really won't be able to use that data because they won't be able to, they won't be able to use it on a desktop machine, and they're not going to be able to use it on their phone, either because it's going to take up too much bandwidth, or they're not going to be able to afford how much data it's going to use. So it's really important to think about that, and it's something that we are starting work on now, but is not part of this next report. But it's something that I'm working on more and more, and I will give a plug for a new podcast that I just discovered. It is called, what is it called? It's called like Chax. It has a very strange name because it's, here it is. There it is. It's called Chax Chat. I'll put it in the chat window in a minute. I will say that this podcast kind of starts at like more of an intermediate level of knowledge around accessibility, which I'm not. Like I was really hoping for like, here's the beginner level, like here's how you make a PowerPoint more accessible, and here's how you make a PDF more accessible. It really kind of starts more intermediate than that. But I'll find the link and drop it in here. But I've really been enjoying that particular podcast to learn more about it. Thank you, Esther. I mean, Esther's like, that was fast. I didn't even know you could type that fast. That was amazing. I didn't finish the sentence. I think we're like this today. We're mind melding. Okay, so I'll stop there on that question.
Great, thank you so much for those resources. And I saw Don also provided a alt text resource called WebAim. And I saw that dropped a couple times. So thank you so much for that plug. Somebody also asked if you could speak a little bit more about your switch from quant to qual approaches. I know you touched on that a bit, but could you expand on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I'm an labor economist by training. So, my graduate school training and my professional work has always been quantitative. It's been getting data and running regressions. And I would say 2018, I started doing much more qualitative work. So I started doing work around in the SNAP program, interviewing program administrators around the country. And the amount of, I'm sure many people in here are doing qualitative work. The amount of information that you can learn from people who are either administering a program or participating in a program is just much richer and much deeper and much, in many ways, better than what you're going to get out of these big surveys. So let me, I guess I'll just say two other things. One of the things that I often hear, because I do a lot of teaching about data visualization, is from qualitative researchers are always sort of complaining that they can't visualize their qualitative data because they've got these interviews and they've got focus groups and they've got text, and you can't like make a bar chart out of text. And the go-to always seems to be a word cloud. And I'm sure many of you have seen these word clouds. You take your text, you calculate the frequency of the words, and then you size the words based on their frequency. I don't love word clouds because it's really hard for me to like know the difference between the frequency, and like it doesn't give me any numbers. They also will, your perception of the words will vary depending on the font and the color and the layout of the words. Sometimes they're horizontal, sometimes they're vertical. So let me just say, I guess, a couple of things on data viz for qualitative research. There are a lot of ways to visualize your qualitative work, okay? So for example, maybe I can bring up another presentation, right, Esther?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I just want to show a couple of examples here. I'm guessing there's a lot of people on this call who do qualitative work, and okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do this real quickly because we only have 10 minutes and I want to make sure that we have time for other questions, but so real quickly, this is the word cloud from President Obama's 2016 State of the Union address. You probably can see the word America used a lot real quickly, the word American quickly. And then secondly, you probably see world and Americans because they're oriented the other way, so they don't jump out immediately. Now, would you have known from that word cloud that the president focused on climate change, a moonshot to cure cancer, and a movement to change the political system? There's no way you would have picked out those important topics. So one strategy that a research team out of UC Berkeley has been working on is, instead of just making one word cloud, is to break up the text into semantic groups and then create smaller word clouds. So this would be a set of word clouds for Obama's speech. So you can see here, talking about curing cancer, global warming, foreign policy, the war on terror, the economy and jobs. So you get a different perspective of the data because you've broken the data into its semantic groups. Is this more work? Sure is, but it's probably a better visualization. But let me just show you like one other minute. There are lots of other ways to do these. I'm going to flip through these. This is a histogram that uses words. This is names of music artists. Instead of just showing the bars, you actually show the words. And I have a little tutorial on my YouTube page about how to create this in Excel. So this can be done in Excel. I want to show just a couple of, you can color the phrases. So this is from, where is this from? The Times? This is the Times. They took Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton's nomination speeches and they just colored in phrases. You know, pink is what's wrong with the country, green is what's good about the country. They did yellow for promises, vision, and policy proposals. So and then they have the specific clips below it. So you can use, there are other ways to visualize your qualitative data rather than, you know, just doing word clouds, which is what I see all the time. And I'll share, this is the last one I'll share. This is from the Washington Post after the Michael Brown shooting outside St. Louis. You can see that they've taken quotes from the statements and they've taken pieces of those quotes and they've ordered them in these different categories and then added color, of course. So charging at the top and then surrender at the bottom. And then further below in this particular news story, they had the full quote. But it's another way to sort of take the qualitative data, which you're already doing as a qualitative researcher, right? You're already pulling out those specific quotes that are, you know, that are evidence for your hypothesis and actually visualizing them in some particular ways. And then the other thing I'll say just on my specific experience with qualitative research is, you know, I just don't know what I don't know. Like, I mean, again, like I'm just learning, but like, I'm sure, you know, we did 20 some odd interviews for this next iteration of the paper. And I'm sure there's things that we could have done better or things that we didn't do that we could have done. And so I think we really just, as various fields of people who are on this call, we just need to do better about I think, especially for the next generation, of teaching them more about qualitative methods as well as the quantitative methods.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. And this was an much earlier question from Donna Mertens. And she asked about how this topic you've been talking about today relates to the international space.
That's a really good question. So I'm not sure I have a great answer for you. I will say for data visualization, you know, color is like a really big concern when it comes to international work, right? The color red in Asian cultures means something very different than it does in Western cultures. It's just a specific, you know, just a simple example. Other countries, for example, France, federal surveys in France. This is what someone told me on Twitter. So I'm not sure this is true. I mean, it's Twitter, so you have to like discount everything by 90%. But French federal surveys, they actually don't or can't ask about race. So I don't know, what does that mean when you're trying to conduct research? I'll say, oh, okay. So Donna, okay. All right. Donna has confirmed. So now I can up the Twitter respectability ratio up a couple of percentage points. I'll call it the Mertens factor, and just raise it up a little bit. So I guess, so we didn't focus on international work, although I will. Esther, how long do I have? I have a couple minutes?
Yeah.
All right, give me one more, because I didn't have time to show you this one piece, but now that I have a couple minutes, I will. So one other thing that we talk about in the report a lot is how we use icons. So I want to show you my favorite. It's either, depending on how you want to view it, it's my favorite or least favorite icon graph. So give me just 20 seconds to undo these. All right, so icons are a great way to visualize data. You get, again, as I said earlier, people can connect with the data, people can see themselves in the data. There's lots of problems with this visualization. The pink colors, the image of the icon with the dress, it doesn't start at 0. I used to make fun of this graph, like, oh, haha, I'm sure women in India are like super insulted by this graph. And And then I had a woman in one of my classes that was from Latvia, and she's like, well, I'm from Latvia and I'm insulted by this graph. And then a few months ago, Saba Ibrahim, who's a photographer, wonderful photographer, put out this tweet. I'll just read it in case your screen's a little small. She wrote, as an Indian woman, I can confirm that too much of my time is spent hiding behind a rock, praying the terrifying gang of international giant ladies and their Latvian general don't find me. Which is funny. It's a little tongue in cheek, but I think it's like the perfect example back to Kim's statement from earlier, that would I feel offended if that's how I was presented in the data, right? And although her statement is pretty funny, I think it is a perfect example that people see themselves in the data. And so when we're using icons, we need to be really careful about really careful about how we represent people. So I don't. And then the other thing I'll say is, like, you know, when you go to Google and you type in nurse icon, like I took this picture a couple of days ago, like the pages of icons, the images will all be things that we identify or we identify as feminine. And you do the same search for boss icon, and you'll see pages of icons that what we would identify as masculine. So the iconography that we're using is still gendered stereotypical, racial stereotypical. And so there's still a lot of work to be done in how we're representing people. So, and this extends to I think, to Donna's question about international work. You know, again, it's one of those things is like, I don't know what I don't know. And I think one of the ways that we can address that is to ask people, is to have conversations with people. And I would say my personal journey over the last 15 months has been to read and to learn and be willing to have these conversations. In Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, she writes about how white people are not comfortable having these conversations about race because we really haven't had to confront these questions. And I think if we can be more open and willing to have these conversations and be a little uncomfortable, and to be comfortable knowing that we're going to say or do something wrong, but it's in the process of growing and doing better, I think we need to understand that and grow together to improve the world that we're in.
Thank you so much, John. Always so insightful, and everyone is saying the same thing in the chat. Everyone's very appreciative. So thank you so much for being here today. I always learn from you, and I can't wait for the new guide to come out. I'm just going to drop a link to John's new book. He's mentioned it once before. He has a copy behind him. I also have my copy here. So wish we could be signing autographs today, but it's a great book. So if you haven't already, get one yourself. So there's a link to the Amazon link. And then, as always, we just appreciate you all as Washington Evaluators members and being here with you all, learning with you. We're honored to have John here today. I know a lot of you sound like you've been admirers of his work. John is going to send me the report as soon as it's released, and then I will send it out to all the registrants of this event as well. I sent this earlier in the chat, but there is an events materials page where the recording of this webinar today and also the materials associated with it will be shared. As always, I also want to drop the links related to Washington Evaluators. So there are some upcoming events. I already dropped the one for Ann Emery earlier, but we have lots of other upcoming events. I know everyone here should be a member already, but if you want to invite others to join us during these events, please feel free to share our membership link as well. We also have a new professional scholarship. And so if you want to look into that as well, we do provide support for new and emerging evaluators as well. So thank you again, everyone, for being here, especially John. Thank you so much. I wish we were in a room and you could hear the applause and everything, but we are all very greatly appreciative of your work, and keep doing what you're doing. We love following you. And I also dropped earlier John's website, policyviz.com. Is that right? .com or .org?
Yep.
.com.
Yep.
And he's also active on Twitter as well, so you can find him all over and see his little insights all the time. So thank you everyone for being here. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and a safe and fun Memorial Day weekend. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.